Welcome back to another tutorial, this time a little bit different. It's a tutorial on something I made because it's a piece of functionality that you guys can use. This is my graphing panel. There is a video published on my channel which is the Neos Festa entry for it, but I would want to make a slightly longer video to go over it, so let's go over it. Let's hop over into Smooth POV. You can find this inside my public folder Tools, and you should be looking for the latest version, which is just look for large numbers, right? This thing gets changes sort of multiple times a day sometimes. First thing that you need to do when you're using it is to configure the overall settings. So for now, though, just to get things moving, I'm just going to configure the one that's red, which is here, updating user, and that needs to have a user in it, so you can just hit set, then that's done. And then you need to discuss what do you want to graph? And you've got many options. You've got float3, float_q, and int, which was added the other day because we needed it for some reason. I'm going to go ahead and add float_q, otherwise known as rotation, for just a moment. The reason behind that is that's really easy to see how it works. So the next thing you're going to need to do is to start specifying what you want to graph. So now I've said, hey, I want to graph a float_q. Let's graph my wrist rotation. So I'm going to go ahead and inspect my wrist. That'll get the wrist collider, so I'll go up to the wrist actually. And you'll see here when I waggle this wrist around that we get data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab rotation and drop it into the reference here. And you'll see instantly that the data starts, and that's because right now with this index field here set to 0, we are graphing the 0th index of that float q. I don't use x, y, and z because in some cases float3s aren't x, y, z, so it's just the index of the value that you're looking at. So this is x-axis at this point. So first of all, you'll see that we're getting data that's going off the screen, and that's where these top bits come in. We've got max and min here. So what I usually like to do is I like to look at my data and see, hey, what is my realistic min and max? And with a wrist, I think 90 is probably a good measure there. So I'm going to go ahead and update this to be positive 90 to negative 90. And now this looks a lot better. So you can see my wrist going up and down. If I do it slower, we'll get a lot more spread out data. If you're seeing that weird line on the end there, I do believe that's a bug, and I've got it on my list to take a look at it. It used to be on the left, and now it's on the right, but I'll take a look at it when I can. So there you go. There's the data going up and down. If you want to change how much data you have, you can change this number here, points. So if you drop it down to 100, what you'll see is a lot less data is visible. This is good for applications that have a lot more data that you just want to see as a passing window. And it also sort of like zooms down on stuff a little bit more. I usually like keeping this at roughly 1,000. There is a limit, and it's limited by the underlying components. I believe it's 53,000 or something like that. But there we go. Above that is the update rate, and that's how often you want to take a value. This is currently set up to be 60 times a second, which I think is probably the maximum that we can do before we start having performance issues by just, graphing the data. So do keep that in mind. But we could also drop it down to, let's say, let's drop it down to half a second, right? So if I do that and then that, see that there's a half a second in between there. This will also take forever to scroll off because we've got 1,000 values at half a second each. So you do 1,000 times half, so 500 seconds. This whole thing would be 500 seconds. I'm going to drop that up to, I think it was 0.16, isn't it? That will do for display purposes right now. That's roughly 60 times a second. So now we're back up to real time. So that's the top settings. There's also the index colored. You can also do color here. This brings up a color selector, so you can go, here we go. There's a pink graph, fantastic. You can also label it, and I do recommend that you label it. Once you've got multiple graph lines on here, you don't know what's going on. So I'm also going to go ahead and label that, and I'll say hand X rotation. There we go. Next to that, you've got an offset property. Offset will move the graph line up or down the graph. So if I do here offset by, let's say 20, you'll see that now our baseline is 20 units higher. If I do a higher number, you'll see that to much more of an effect. So let's do 50, for example. There you go. So now our new sort of baseline for my wrist is up here. That's useful if you have multiple things on display and you want to separate them by a little bit of headroom. I'm going to drop that down to 0. And then next up is gain. So gain is really only useful when you've got data that is small on the same graph with data that is big. And what it does is it's just a multiplier. So in this case, we don't have any gain because this data is quite large in its sense. But let's say I wanted to, I don't know, crunch that down a little bit so that I got a smoother waveform. I could times that to 0.5, and now you'd see, hey, all those values are now half as high on the graph. Next to that is a radio button for raw, velocity, or acceleration. Velocity will do the typical Neos way of doing velocity, and you'll see that if I do really large things, you'll see that it gets really large in terms of velocity. When you're doing velocity, I recommend lowering the gain quite far down. Might even need to lower it even more than that. You can look at the raw data and see what you need to do. If you're doing acceleration, we haven't used acceleration that much when I've been using this, but you probably need to lower it by even more because acceleration is like velocity squared or whatever. I can't remember the exact functionality right now, but it does end up with a lot of noisy data, so make sure you clamp that gain down all the way. Now you can add multiples. Let's say I wanted to graph not only the X rotation, let's graph the Y and the Z rotation. So we could just drop these in here like this. All of these fields, by the way, support grabbing and dropping, all of them. So we can do this, and then back this out and say Y rotation. Back this out and say Z rotation. And then I drop this to 1, which would be index 1, and then that to 2, and that's index 2. And now we've got all 3 rotations. When we do that, I would usually suggest you do red, green, and blue. And now you've got them all here. And in this case, it might show an example of why you want to offset things. You can see here that blue and red are kind of lined up. So to offset those, we could go ahead and say, hey, let's move red down because red is quite flat compared to the rest. So let's move red down by -40. Probably need to do even more than that. So let's go even more than that. -400. -600. There you go. Now that trace has moved down to here on the bottom. And so you've now got headroom between each of them. I don't know if headroom's the right place, but whatever. You've now got room between each traces to look at them individually. The blue and the green by just the way that the data is coming out, and the red based on the offset that's been applied here. Oh, that's why. It's because the gain's low. There we go. The order goes offsets applied and then gains applied, so that probably needs to go back down to something like -5 now. Yeah, there we go. So again, you can just play around with these till you get values that you want. So for example, if I do, I think that was -600, drop that down to 10 again, I could put that on each of these, and then I could leave that one at 0, and I could say, hey, this one goes to +600, and then all of these traces would be separate by quite a lot of room, allowing you to get a lot more sort of insight into both of them. So that is that. Same thing with the float 3. You can do again there, the index there. For float and also for int, you don't need to specify an index just because it's a single property. Let's see what we can draw with for int. Order offset, well, it's going to just be 0, but whatever. We'll just drop that into... Actually, I believe order offset is a long, so that's not going to help. Maybe update order. There we go. So update order is an int. That will just be 0, but it does show, hey, you can graph ints as well. You can clear those out by doing that. You can also turn them off. Let's say you don't want to see a particular data line. Let's say temporarily you don't want to see blue. There you go. Blue's turned off. Turn it back on again. Of course, you can delete lines using delete. So let's clean back up to that. Additionally, and added recently, is this stop button. This can be triggered by logic. So you can just send stop or pause or play, and that'll trigger this. You can have like edge triggers and stuff like that. Like if you detect in your logic that something is happening, you can send it to the graph and say pause, right? And then it will show you the data there. So for example here, if I take my hand here and I give that a big flick up, you'll see that big flick up is there, but that data is scrolling off the screen. So if I want to preserve that for analysis or to look at it, I can hit stop here, and it's going to stop new data recording. So I can preserve this up momentum here, and I can look at it on my graph. And then if I want to collect data again, I can go to positive again here. That is, I think it's very powerful. I'm using it all the time. You can even use it with things like logic. All you need to do is basically get to a point where you have a float3 field, a float field, a float q field, or an int field, and you can just drop it into here and take a look. You can also use these standard buttons to get back to where that is. So I can just go ahead and hit up here, and that takes me back to where the data is. I find that super useful if I've made this graph and then come across it later and I haven't forgotten what I was graphing. You can see how useful it is, and bear with me here as we take a journey across the land to my iPlace. This is my home world. That's the reason why I'm recording it is so I can show this. And we've got a bunch of data tracking here. In this case, this is looking, I need to hit set there. This is looking at the rotation axis of this camera, which is that yellow, orange sphere there that's looking at this clock face. There was a mathematical reason that we were doing this, and that's because we wanted to keep the clock face upright after we had applied the look rotation. And again, here you can see, hey, we've got this configured, and we can see the X, Y, Z rotation. So I use that there. This is some variant of that attached to an actual person. Again, I don't really remember why that's here, but again, we can graph that. So I'm using this all the time. Let me do check it out and let me know what you think. And I'll certainly add stuff to it. I'm adding stuff to it all the day. But if you've got features or stuff you want to see on it, do let me know. I will speak to you next time. Bye bye.